Well, thank you very much, everybody. I really appreciate the opportunity to chat today. Um, the This is a really exciting topic and period for me, largely because when we think about the future of cloud security, and we think about technology in general, what I find to be really exciting and what I was asked to speak about was this notion of how do you dovetail this with your security career. And so that's really what I want to chat about today, right? So evolving a career while transforming through technology. So just by a little bit of background, I've been a CISO at multiple organizations. I was a CISO at GE Treasury, Fannie Mae, JP Morgan for the corporate investment bank. And I'm going to walk a little bit through that journey. But more specifically, I want to talk about how my career arc was really informed or transformed through technology, and how and why that is so important and pivotal to cloud security, and how organizations should or could think about this, and how each of us could or should think about this as well. So let me jump directly into it. So this is actually an image I've been wanting to use for a presentation for a very, very long time, largely because I think it's just a phenomenal story. It's a great movie, of course, but it really goes along the arc of somebody, growing up and figuring out who they want to be. And so I want to share a little bit about my career story. So, when I think back to when I was a young warthog, so when I was early in my career, what was that like? I started off, I was an enlisted guy in the Air Force. I did network security, cybersecurity. I was a hands-on practitioner, and I loved it. And I think that, as most of you can relate, at the age of 18, 19, 20, I thought I had everything figured out. From the notion of I had all the answers, I knew all the tech. I thought, everything was going to be perfect. And then you start to realize that you really don't know anything. And that's when I think you start to recognize and grow as a leader. So I was an enlisted person in the Air Force. I spent a tremendous amount of time practicing and honing my craft, and really understanding and deeply getting into various security scanning tools and technologies. And once I thought I understood those, I thought I was good. But then I realized that in order to be relevant in cybersecurity, in risk management, in technology, you have to constantly be changing. So I did that. I spent a lot of time learning, and I continue to evolve, both on the compliance, regulatory requirements. I eventually took over a cybersecurity program at GE. And so at GE Treasury, it was a really, really great, exciting piece here. But then I learned I didn't know anything about operating at a multinational at scale, like for the General Electric. And the advent of looking at new technology and how we thought about that and what that meant. Those were all new things I had to again, push myself and channel. From there, I went into Fannie Mae, where I was a CISO. And I distinctly remember working a number of incidents and facing situations that I felt woefully unprepared for. And that was one of the things I love about leadership, is that you realize that, hey, you take all these tools and skills that you've built, and where you think that you're ready to face that challenge, and you face and deal with something that's completely new. As a CISO at Fannie Mae, we went through, a really, really dramatic transformation, and both on the people, the process, the technology side, all of it. But the technology was such an important facet. And so I began, even at GE, I began to spend a tremendous amount of time listening, learning to vendors, software providers, to the point of where I would take unsolicited vendor cold calls. I would actually spend a tremendous amount of time looking at and working through, new emerging technologies, and then trying to understand what was actually working, what was actually the struggle point. And then how did we think about this, or how did I think about this as related to the organization that I was with? From GE to Fannie Mae, and then Fannie Mae to JP Morgan. Again, thinking I had it sorted out. Large multinational GE, Fannie Mae, a big, 60-some% of the U.S. housing market, to, oh my goodness, we're moving $7 trillion a day in flow. And it was a really, really different set of conversations. And the technology solutions that we had to look at from supporting the private bank to the investment bank components to the actual different, settlement days, the traders. It was a really, really eye-opening piece. And there were really three aspects that really helped me to think about and be ready to manage everything. What does all this have to do with cloud native security, though? When I was asked to kind of think about this and pull this together, I felt that the core principles, the core three things that helped me to become successful as a CISO at a Fortune 20 company, to a venture capitalist, to an investor, and to founding an organization, really resonated into this conversation. And so I want to touch on those three things now a bit. So the rule of three. In marketing and economics, we really always think about the rule of three as being the guiding principles, the guiding aspects of how people consume data, consume information. You can look at, hey, I have three big competitors out there. What are the three traits that really drove the success of that product or organization? And when I think about my career as related to technology transformation, these are the three things that really stood out to me and stand out to me today. One, consistency. Consistency is a fascinating piece, largely because we have to be consistent and flexible. Consistent but adaptable. What does that mean? How do you strike that balance? But there are consistent behaviors that we would take as individuals, and I'll get into those more deliberate in just a moment. Adaptability. As a young hands-on technician, I thought I was adaptable until I started to meet people that were writing in languages and coding and things I'd never even heard of. And then I realized that I knew nothing. And I love this notion of almost like a Game of Thrones, Thrones reference, like Jon Snow knows nothing. And that's how I felt. And I think that we need to, as leaders, as individuals and practitioners, we need to make sure that we're adaptable. And then one of the biggest things that I failed to realize early in my career is just the sheer volume of sacrifice of what it takes to actually move from being a practitioner to an executive leader. And that sacrifice isn't just borne by us as individuals, but also by us really as leaders, as family members, and there's a number of those things. So I'm gonna jump right into them and kind of go from there. So what is consistency about? Well, consistency is it's something that it's an underlying theme, right? It's being able to lean into those habits and to make things a corresponding habit so that we actually can survive. And if you think about this, our brains want to simplify and make things as easy as possible. It's why when you get in your car and you start to back up in your car, you actually, oftentimes you'll forget that you actually did that. Or when you're driving, you forgot that, hey, did I drive 5 miles? I completely forgot about that because our brains, we drive into an autopilot piece here. And the same thing can be said really about how we kind of think about our careers and how we kind of think about leading teams. So for me, consistency really meant getting into and deeply understanding and running through a playbook. And the playbook that I used was really specific. I would go into an organization and I would ask the questions and just challenge every single assumption. And this was most prevalent for me at GE. I distinctly remember looking at a set of Active Directory controls and configurations and talking with the team and saying, okay, why is this setting set like this? Because it didn't make any sense. It was a bad setting, we'll say, and a bad set of controls. And the overwhelming answer was, I don't know, but it must have been a good idea because somebody at GE put it in place. And that stuck with me. It stuck with me because I said, well, we have to challenge the assumptions. And that was a consistent aspect that I took with me every single role from there on, of challenging every single assumption. And then also leaning into the people. So looking at the people and mapping back, are they supported? Do they have the right skills to manage the technology? And really looking at those pieces from that dimension. That was a big aspect on the career impact. So what does this mean to a cloud, to the cloud as we look to secure the cloud? Consistency in my mind, as I kind of think about this, should be an aspect of driving repeatable execution, very, very repeatable processes, and fundamentally looking at and thinking about why or how we really we why or how or what we're really trying to do. Standardized deployment, standardized control planes, standardized views, standardized ways of looking at that, and then being able to enforce that through an automated or consistent model is critical to scalability. And that's one of the most important aspects, one of the biggest values of cloud, of course, right? When we live in a world of where we don't have to maintain a tremendous amount of kit and ecosystem on our own, it really creates a lot of opportunity, but it also creates a tremendous amount of risk. And this is where cloud security can really go wrong. If we are inconsistent in how we design and build, if we are inconsistent in how we audit or control, or how we govern and manage. And the best example I can kind of give, and really taking this even back to a career perspective, is that when we do things manually, if we are building a new server, or if we're building a new set of configs, and we do that manually, a human error is going to end up in one or a few locations. In cloud, it's a multitude. And it's the best proxy of saying, what does this look like when you're building a leading or an organization? Because when you manage one person or one small team, and you make an error in setting a strategy or direction, you may impact a small team. But when you impact and you manage a large organization, that's a scale risk. And that we have the same risk and opportunity with cloud. So consistency is critical. It's really important, both from a career perspective as well as how we think about cloud security. So my underlying thought here is that we need to build and design habits that really enable us to survive as an organization in a really strong way, that enable us to govern in a really profound way, but that are very, very repeatable. So let me move on here to the second point, which is adaptability. Now, on the surface, consistent and adaptable, or consistent and flexible, almost feels like they would be at odds in some cases here, and I don't really think that they are. I think that when we look at these pieces here, they can go hand in hand, because the consistent aspect should be those core baseline habits, those core baseline rails, if you will. And then it's the adaptability or flexibility of what effectively rides along those rails. So let's talk about some career impacts then, or what did this look like? I mentioned early in my career, I spent a lot of time, talking with vendors. I would take unsolicited vendor calls, listening to cold calls. I think I did it on Tuesdays from 3 to 4, every single Tuesday from 3 to 4. It eventually drove my admins mad. But what it really enabled me to do is to go back to the security and technology teams and challenge the notion of whether we knew everything, and to say, hey, I've heard about this new tech, or I just spoke to a founder, or I just spoke to an investor, and this is something that they're looking at. This is something that they view as a tremendous problem and impact, and how do we think about this? On the same token, throughout my career, I spent a lot of time listening to various members of the organization, not just senior leaders, but junior people who are hands-on in the technology. And I realized that being adaptable or flexible in both the strategy and direction, as well as the challenging how I thought or how I assumed something was working, was really, really critically important. Some of the best leaders that I've worked for have really been truly adaptable. And one of my favorite quotes from one of the most amazing speakers I think out there is actually Simon Sinek. So if you don't know Simon Sinek, he's a brilliant speaker, thought leader when it comes to leadership and challenging how we become better new leaders. But he says, be flexible, or be obsessed with the destination, but flexible about the route. And that's one of the things I think that is really been paramount for me in my career. So how do we take that to a cloud construct? How do we think about this in the notion of cloud security? Well, I think there are a couple ways. One, if we're obsessed with the destination, first we have to define that. Does that just mean being super locked down? No, right? Security is part of this risk equation. We have to have the right balance of risk. We have to have the right balance of risk acceptance to enable the business, to enable the organization to go as fast as possible here. So that we, in order to do that, we have to be flexible in how we do that. We have to be flexible in the various tools, mechanisms, and understand that new capabilities are going to continually emerge. And that's where consistency and adaptability really go hand in hand. By having really secure governance controls, planes, views, models, builds, the ability to orchestrate a cohesive vision or standard of security practices. Those types of controls and habits enable us to pivot. They enable us to scale, and they enable cloud to actually fundamentally be secure while meeting the business needs. Because as we all know, business needs may dictate a new instance, a new server, a new system, a new product capability in a much shorter timeline than we would expect. And a really, really good example here, I think, is actually taking it back to earlier this year. Most organizations across the world, I would say, although they had some sort of a digital or transformation agenda, they were not planning on being able to support fully work from home in the span of weeks. And that's what they did. Where, a number of organizations and clients that we've worked with, where they've said, hey, you know what, they had a 1 to 2 year journey to be able to support some sort of a transformation agenda similar to what they did in March. They condensed that, and they really, really shrunk that. And it was because they actually had to be very, very adaptable. Now, on that same token, some of those organizations accelerated their movement to the cloud. And, a big focus there for them really should be and needs to be, what are the rails? How do they build that? How can they be consistent in their execution, but adaptable to business, to emerging business needs, challenges, and fundamentally being able to exceed expectations there? So I think this is one of the most important aspects here. So consistency, and then leading into fundamentally adaptability here. This is one that doesn't get talked about a lot, and that's sacrifice. As I would say, most of you know, as leaders within your organizations, teams, companies, it's amazing how much sacrifice we actually have to take, how much we actually have to put up there. And it's not just the financial risk of if you start a company, or if you're venture backed in investing in an organization for a VC. But when you are leading an organization, when you're building a team, when you are focused on a mission, a lot of times we have to be very, very deliberate in the sacrifices that we are purposefully making. And so let me think about this from a career impact piece here. When I was a young man, I didn't think about sacrifice at all. I thought about the goal. I thought about I wanted to achieve X. As a really young man, being able to say I was an executive at Wall Street was never on my dream board, right? I had much less lofty aspirations based on where I grew up, but I also didn't realize the sheer volume of time that would be required to be successful, the number of sleepless nights that you would actually have to take, as well as the impacts on your family. Not being able to spend the time with those loved ones, or not being able to invest and do those things that you really, really want to. One of the best stories I've heard about career sacrifice is this. It's called being barbecue poor. And if you've never heard that, I'll highlight or explain it here. And the way it goes is that there are people, say like a Jeff Immelt of the world, who may have a lot of money. There are CEOs, founders who have a lot of money, but they're barbecue poor. What that means is that they cannot actually afford to take the time to have a barbecue with their friends on the weekend, or with their family. And when I heard that story, it really put it into perspective for me about what do I want to be rich in, and what am I willing to be poor in? Because we have to count big sacrifices, and we have to count small sacrifices, and eventually we have to add them up. And if you think about this on the notion of sitting on a scale here, being barbecue poor is pretty poor. And so that was something that was really, really impactful to me. And so as I've chosen what organizations I've enjoyed working with and building relationships, it's been fascinating and really exciting to identify organizations, like Rapid7, like DivvyCloud, who find the right balance in being able to be excellent in what they do, but also being able to be excellent in how they do it. So what does this mean from a cloud perspective? When we go to cloud, we actually have to make a bunch of different sacrifices. When we think about securing the organization from in an orchestrated world, we have to be very deliberate on what sacrifices we are willing to make. And so let's dive into that just a little bit. If you rewind back a number of years before everybody was going to the cloud, there was a lot of talk of like, we're going to the cloud, we're just going to save a ton of money, everything's just going to be better. And you could never actually have a conversation with somebody where they would talk about a negative. Like, there was no negatives to the cloud. And then the story started to shift a little bit, and they realized, wow, it's not as easy as just flipping a switch. It's not as easy in just pivoting team members over, because what we learned is that the same skills, the same technologies that we'd come to depend and rely on to protect our infrastructure, to manage our infrastructure on premise, they were dramatically different. It goes back to being adaptable. We had to relook at, what is the security stack that we would instantiate in the cloud? How do we think about cloud native first? And can you take something that was, engineered and not really well designed for the cloud, but maybe it was a data center centric perspective first, and kind of, reverse that back into something? And so we had to make very deliberate sacrifices on trade-offs of saying, okay, we're not going to get the ability to go chase down that sysadmin and say, go turn that back on, or to simply go build out the new hardware because we have the money and we're going to go do that. Instead, the cloud journey required us to rethink about the associated risk with contracts. It required us to rethink about the sacrifices that we would have to make in scalability and of the risk of things going wrong at scale. Now, you have to weigh that with the tremendous value of things going right at scale. There are huge opportunities of cost savings. There are huge opportunities of being able to have, I love this distributed, immutable, and ephemeral ecosystem. Those are really, really powerful value propositions for organizations to look at, to think about, but they don't come cost-free. So one of the things that as organizations look at how they're orchestrating, how they're engineering, building for the cloud, it is really important to think through, do you actually understand the trade-offs and sacrifices that you will and have to make here. So we've touched on really three brief things here, right? We've touched on consistency, we've touched on adaptability, we touched on sacrifice. Throughout my career in going from a hands-on practitioner to a CISO at a massive, large multinational, when I was at JP Morgan, those were three core pieces that really helped to shape how I think about cybersecurity, how I think and thought about leading people, and more importantly, I would say, or equally as important, is how I think and thought about technology. Because when it comes to people, we can kind of go down this route of like, hey, I want to treat people how I would want to be treated. I want to, do the prudent person. I want to be the good leader that I would want to be. When it comes to technology, though, we have to push ourselves outside of our comfort zones. We have to think about, what is the thing that's going to be that next evolution? What is the piece that I need to be ready to adapt to? Have I built the guardrails of consistency that will enable me, those habits enable me to be successful as I adapt? And then what are the sacrifices and trade-offs that I'm willing to make, both as a personal a career professional, as well as along this cloud journey? So, that's really the presentation of really what I wanted to cover. As we and as you think about and continue along your cloud journey, the aspects of orchestration, the aspects of having consistent, repeatable guardrails, of having a defined control plane that will enable your organization to be successful and to really be to accelerate those pieces. Those are all aspects I really encourage you to look at. And then fundamentally, looking at building those control ecosystems that will be a force multiplier for you. So with that, I think I was asked to make sure we had some time to look at some questions here. So let me make sure I kind of tackle that here. And so we have one question here. How do you address skills shortage amongst your staff? Is the first question. And then the second one is, do you expect your staff to make the same sacrifices you as an executive are willing to make by sacrificing work-life balance? So skill shortages are it's a real thing. Now, one of the most fascinating questions I've had with other executives, other CISOs, is this notion of why do we have skill shortages, though? And I believe that we place as individuals too much of an emphasis on pets. And if you've not heard this analogy, I love this story of this analogy here of that as technologists, we have pets, we have servers, we name them, we care for them, and at the end of the day, you want to keep your pet. If you've named a server, there's a personal mindset that goes into patching it, keeping it consistent. And it's very, very different from the notion of how things function in the cloud, which is more of a cattle perspective, where if you have sick cattle, you get different cattle. And that's where you have an ephemeral ecosystem. So the skill shortage piece is actually, I think, largely driven because we have too many pets, too much of an emphasis on trying to keep old legacy systems alive, and not enough of an emphasis on cattle, moving more to an ephemeral ecosystem of where we can have an orchestrated and secure control plane here. How do you expect your staff to make this, or do you expect your staff to make the same sacrifice? I don't think that leaders can. I think that that's a really painful piece. I think it's something I struggled with. I actually personally, I just assumed my wife would be comfortable with the sacrifices I was willing to make. And it took me a number of years to get to the point of actually having that conversation with her and her saying, hey, we need to strike a better work-life balance. So I think being able to listen to your team, being able to encourage them to strike that balance is part of the burden that we have as leaders. In times of uncertainty, what should be the focus for skills development? I do think that fundamentally scripting and continuing to learn are really important pieces. As we move to a more orchestrated and cloud native world, I think understanding the fundamentals of frameworks like NIST CSF, overall governance control ecosystems, and seeing how they map back, I think those are tremendously powerful. I think they're really powerful for technologists to deeply understand, because then they can build the orchestration tools and security planes to effectively meet those governance standards. And then the last minute, one last question was, what would you consider proper enablers for time commitment for work-life balance, especially during COVID? I think this is a really hard question. I think that obviously we need to strike a balance, and we need to encourage people. I do think that throughout this time period of COVID, we've seen upticks in productivity, largely because people are working extensive numbers of hours, and organizations are going to have to come and strike that balance as things kind of land back. So the more we can do to support orchestration, the more we can do to drive macro solutions, I think those are going to be really, really valuable. Last piece here is that's really the gist of everything I wanted to cover. So I want to make sure that I specifically cover and introduce the next group appropriately. So really, it's going to be the so we have the ESG VP and Group Director of Cybersecurity, Doug Cahill, and Rapid7 Cloud Security Practice SVP, Brian Johnson. Brian is someone I've really gotten a chance to know and enjoy over the last 2 years that I've known him. I think that you guys will find this session to be really amazing. So please, thank you for your time, and thanks for letting me share.